In this lesson, we're going to take a deep dive into OAuth. So we spent most of this chapter working with OAuth and setting up GitHub providers for OAuth, using Supabase in order to interact between our app and that GitHub app. But we haven't really talked about what OAuth is or how we're using it in this application. So why do we even need OAuth in the first place? The main reason is that we want to stop sharing login credentials with our applications. We only want to enter in the password on the service itself. Instead, with OAuth, we're able to share tokens that represent that permission to log in somewhere. And it helps a lot that this is a widely adopted industry standard. So whenever we're interacting with logins and credentials, we're able to use OAuth and understand how OAuth works because it's used practically everywhere. So let's imagine that we are trying to build ourselves a Twitter bot. So on the left, we've got the user, myself here, and I'm going to interact with the bot. I'm going to set it up, configure it to post hourly or daily or whatever it is that I want to do. And then that bot is going to interact with Twitter and do all the posting on my behalf. In the past, before OAuth, I would have to take my username and password and send it over to the Twitter bot so that the Twitter bot could then use that username and password on Twitter. And now the bot is able to log in into my account and post, like things, retweet, all of that. However, if that bot turns evil, it still has our username and password, which is not a good thing. So to avoid that, the industry came up with this idea of OAuth. We have you as the user, we have the bot, which we call a client or third-party application. Then we have the resource server. This is the thing that we want to access. So this would be the Twitter timeline, being able to post new tweets, retweet. That's what the resource server is. It's the thing that we actually want to access. The real innovation with OAuth comes with this addition of the authorization server. Now, before we talked about the difference between authentication and authorization. And authorization is the process of determining if someone can access something. And that's exactly what this server does. It's a separate server, and its only job is to determine, can this user access this resource? In our app, we're not using Twitter, but we're accessing GitHub instead. And so the flow works something like this. We want to log in through our app, so we hit the login button. Then our app redirects to the GitHub authorization server. Here, we log in to GitHub. And if we're already logged in, then GitHub knows this and it can check. And it will just redirect us back once we've logged in. But when we redirect back to the app, it actually gives us this access token. And this access token is the key to the whole process. Because once we have that token, we can then, from our app, access the resource server. So with our Twitter bot example, once we have logged in and gotten that access token, we can then use that token when we want to make tweets, when we want to retweet, when we want to like. And that access token is what the resource server is expecting. This access token represents our permission to actually interact with it. And in this way, OAuth lets us avoid the need of passing around our username and password And instead of passing these credentials around everywhere, we instead pass around this access token. For the purposes of our application with the online course platform, we're not actually accessing this resource server. So we're using the OAuth flow in a little bit of a simpler way. We're not creating PRs, we're not closing issues, we're not needing to do any of that kind of stuff on GitHub. So all that we're doing is using the fact that GitHub has this authorization server, which can tell us, yes, this person is Michael Thiessen. And once we get that access token back, then we can look at it and say, oh, okay, we know who this person is. And once we get this access token, we can verify that this person does indeed have access to the online course. So let's dig into what this access token looks like and the response that we get from the authorization server. So in our app here, if we open up the application tab and we go into local storage, if we find this key here that starts with SB-, we get the response that Supabase stores in local storage. What we get back from the authorization server is this access token. When that token expires, a refresh token, the type of the token, which is typically just bearer, and then this extra field for the user. Technically, according to the OAuth standard, this access token can be anything, because all that this access token really is a way for the authorization server to communicate with the resource server and tell it that this is, in fact, an authorized person. So since our app is not necessarily needing to inspect this, it doesn't have to be anything specific. But in most cases, this string here is a JSON web token. And so we can copy and paste this whole token. And if we go over to jwt.io, we can paste our token in and it will decode it for us so we can see what's going on here. The first part of our token is the header, which describes how it's been encoded and other metadata like that. Then the bulk of it is the payload. This is all of the metadata, the data about the authenticated user, and information about the token itself. Finally, at the end, we have the signature. The signature is really important because it allows us to verify that this payload was not tampered with, that this token is the correct token, and it allows us to verify that it came from the right spot. So the token is created using the header, the payload, and the secret, which would be shared between the authorization server and the app that we're working with. Because they share the same secret, and because this signature is calculated using the payload, if any one of these things is off, the signature will not be correct, and we can know that. And so the signature gives us some security in knowing that this token is still a good token. But the interesting part here is what's in the payload. The first few fields here in this payload are standard OAuth claims. And these are used in order to determine the audience, who the token is for, the expiration time, and the user of this token. And these fields are mostly useful for, again, communicating between the authorization server and the resource server. So as app developers ourselves, we don't need to concern ourselves with these values as much. The interesting part for us comes with all of this extra metadata. And this extra metadata here is really the reason why we're using OAuth in order to authenticate with our application, because we get the email, we get the phone number if that's created with the GitHub account. We get the profile image, if they're verified, the full name, all this extra information, which is what we need in our app in order to determine if the person has access to the course. We can match based on the email address, for example. So now we've dug into what this token is, typically a JSON web token, but could be anything. We've seen how JSON web tokens work a little bit. And if you want to know more, you can go to jwt.io, and there's lots of articles there on what JWT is and how it works if you want to learn more. One thing that's important to talk about too is this idea of a refresh token. So what most OAuth providers do is they set an expiration time on the token. Once the access token is expired, then we have to use this refresh token to go back to the authorization server and get a new access token. And the reason that we expire tokens like this is because it's possible that tokens can get leaked out. So for example, I have pasted this token into this video for you all to see. And so if this token never expired, you could, in theory, copy this whole thing and then potentially hijack my session or do something nefarious like that. But because this token expires in 3,600 seconds, by the time I've uploaded this video, it will already be expired and you won't be able to do anything like that. So it adds a layer of security for us. However, if we had to log in every few minutes over and over again, that would be a very terrible user experience. And so instead of requiring the user to do that, we provide this refresh token. And this refresh token allows the app to get a new token and log back in again quietly in the background without needing the user to intervene at all. So as you're going around with the app is using this refresh token to get a new token whenever it needs to. And so this is one of those things that Supabase is handling for us. You can see that it starts to get very complicated as you dig into it. We have to deal with all these layers of security and all this stuff. And so it's really nice to have a library that does this for us. I've actually had to implement an OAuth flow like this from scratch before, and it's not the most fun thing to do. It's actually quite tedious, and it forced me to learn this and to understand it, but ideally, we can just use a Supabase module that does it for us. The final major piece of this OAuth flow that I want to discuss before we end this lesson is how tokens get revoked. So as you go about using your GitHub account, over time you log into more and more things with that GitHub account. You log into Mastering Nuxt 3. You go onto this online course platform and use that to log in. Maybe you use this for several other apps that use GitHub as the OAuth provider. Eventually, you have all of these different apps that you've allowed to access your GitHub account in different ways. At some point, you may want to revoke that access and prevent that app from continuing to access your data. So if we come into GitHub, we can revoke the tokens and prevent the app from continuing to access our profile. We'll go down to Settings and Applications, and we'll go over to Authorized OAuth Apps. And you can see here that I have 16 different applications that I've authorized to use with my GitHub account. We've got Auth0 for authentication, Code Sandbox, Mastering Nuxt, Netlify. I have an integration with Notion, Rollbar, StackBlitz. We've got a lot of different things here. And as I go through this, I can see, oh, there's a lot of things that I potentially don't need, yet they continue to be able to access my profile. But from here, I can, for example, come in and revoke access. And what this does is it will prevent that application from using its refresh token to get a new access token. And in that way, we continue to have, as the user, we continue to have control over what applications can access our data. If we had instead given it our login credentials, the username and password, we would have to change the username and password to prevent that application from logging in. But with OAuth, because we use access tokens instead as an abstraction for login credentials, we can revoke those access tokens on a per app basis. And so this gives us a lot more security and a lot more control. And it's just a better system for dealing with authentication. And especially OAuth is a very complicated and deep subject. And luckily for us with Supabase, we don't need to know a lot about it in order to use it. However, if you do want to dig deeper, there are some great resources online. OAuth.com gives you a whole book on understanding OAuth in the deepest sense, as well as jwt.io to learn about JSON web tokens, as we saw before. And I'm sure there's lots of great YouTube videos and other things like that out there as well on OAuth. But again, this concept is not necessary in order to build production applications. I only recently learned how OAuth works, and I struggled for a very long time to understand OAuth, and only recently did it click for me. So if you don't understand it completely, that's fine. As long as you understand the basics and the reason why we have OAuth in the first place, and you can use Supabase or Firebase or whatever tool it is that you want in order to do authentication in your app, then in my mind, that is good enough.